And without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker of the morning. Del Ahlquist, with us here, who many of you will know that name from EWTN. In fact, I think one of the ladies doing the tea from the parish said, "Oh, I know you," she said, "from the television." She said, "I recognise your dimples." Dale is the president of the American Chesterton Society, and he's publisher of Gilbert Magazine. Many of us get that. He's the creator and host of the EWTN television series, The Apostle of Common Sense, the author of 3 books on Chesterton, and the editor of 8 books of Chesterton's writings. He is a senior fellow of the Chesterton Library at Oxford, that Tessa will tell us about, and co-founder of the Chesterton Academy. That's a secondary school in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which last year was named one of the top 50 Catholic high schools in the United States. That was extraordinary when I saw that. When I think of the number of Catholic high schools that there are. That's a terrific achievement. And it's fair to say that he has, I've added this little bit, it is fair to say that he has devoted his life to getting Chesterton out there, and he really has. So, Dale, would you, ladies and gentlemen, if you'd welcome Dale.
This is a really nice, large podium. Okay. There we go. Well, thank you very much, Martin. Thank you all for coming today, for the wonderful invitation to be here. I'm absolutely thrilled and delighted to be here, and thank you, my Lord, for being here as well. It's great to finally meet you. And I'm sorry for all the harassment of these past few years. And that's the last time that I'll apologize to you. All right. I have to risk being an egoist today because I am going to talk about myself, but only for a very good reason. I was assigned, my task here today was, I was assigned to introduce you to Chesterton. This is the introductory talk. And I decided against that detached and objective third-person narrative as if I were an outsider looking in, because I'm anything but an outsider looking in. I'm rather up to my elbows in Chesterton. So your introduction to Chesterton is going to be to relive my introduction to Chesterton. So I'm going to take you through how I got here today. The beginning of the first line in The Everlasting Man is, there are 2 ways of getting home, and one of them is to stay there. Well, I unfortunately took the other route home. I started reading Chesterton like anyone else on my honeymoon. And like any good Baptist, I went to Rome on my honeymoon. And I brought my wife with me, like anyone else. And we were in Rome on the day that Pope John Paul II was shot on our honeymoon. And since I was a Baptist, I was one of the suspects, naturally. But I was simply minding my own business, reading The Everlasting Man. Because what else are you going to do on your honeymoon in Rome? And I chose that book because I knew what important effect that book had on C.S. Lewis. As a Baptist and an evangelical, I was a huge C.S. Lewis fan, and I continued to discover the fact that that C.S. Lewis openly acknowledged his debt to G.K. Chesterton. So that was the book that I knew had a profound influence on his life, and it was the book that he kept recommending to other people to read. And so that was the book that I chose, and as my own introduction to Chesterton. My wife was reading Les Miserables. That's very true. When I started reading The Everlasting Man, I can tell you I had the same sensation that Dorothy L. Sayers said that she had when she first started reading Chesterton. She said it was like a strong wind coming into the building and blowing out all the windows. It was an overwhelming sensation. I knew I was encountering a thinker and a writer unlike any other that I had ever encountered. I felt a little bit of anger as well, because I had graduated from a good college that supposedly was highly rated, and yet I got through 4 years with no exposure to this writer, who obviously was a giant of English literature and who I should have been introduced to as part of a good education. And I was angry about that. And other people have told me the same thing, that when they discovered Chesterton, their first sensation is anger, because how were they cheated out of this great writer? What was it possible that he had disappeared? But of course, the other sensation reading The Everlasting Man was that I had no idea what I was reading. I didn't understand any of it. It was because he took this problem from all angles that I'd never had encountered such a complete thinker before, who brought up mythology and anthropology and history and biology and philosophy and theology and of course poetry, and tied them all together just seamlessly. And I wasn't used to moving my mind from category to category like that. And of course, because I was a product of a very fragmented education, which is what's happened to all of education. We only teach fragments, and we teach in compartments and departments, and we don't teach complete cohesive thinking. And I had never encountered such complete cohesive thinking before, and it was more than I could handle. And yet I saw these truths would come through like rays of light, like this light coming down right here. All of a sudden I'd see the light. And it was things like the way he just so deftly deals with the obsession with evolution and Darwinianism as an explanation for everything. Chesterton says it's sometimes more dangerous to get between the scientist and his bone than between the dog and his bone. And he points out that the one thing we know about the caveman, the one thing that we absolutely, truly, and indisputably know about the caveman is that he was an artist. That's the only hard evidence of what we know the caveman did in his behavior. We have the paintings on the wall. Man is an artist. Art is the signature of man. Something sets man apart from every other creature. And then he goes on to establish the fact that not only is man different from every other creature, there's one certain man that's different from every other man. When Christ stepped on the stage, history changes completely, and nothing else explains what happened better than the Christian explanation. And so then I moved on to the book on St. Francis of Assisi. That was my second Chesterton book. And here's this wonderful description of this universal saint who chose the hard life because it was the happy life, and who threw everything into the abyss of unfathomable thanks, because the best kind of giving is thanksgiving. And this was really my first introduction to truly Catholic writing, but I didn't know that at the time. Then I read Orthodoxy, the book that most epitomizes G.K. Chesterton. Orthodoxy is to Chesterton what Hamlet is to Shakespeare. In fact, it's a similar sensation, because when you read Orthodoxy, you underline the entire book. And it's just like the woman who went to see Hamlet, and she came out and she said, well, it's nothing but quotations. But here's Chesterton describing his amazing and apparently accidental discovery of Christianity, or what he calls his elephantine adventures in pursuit of the obvious. And that's when I started to recognize that Chesterton has this ability to explain the obvious, which is the most difficult thing to explain. It's hard to explain to us the things that we already know. Chesterton does that better than anyone. And the theme of the book is that Christianity is sanity and that everything else is not. And he takes on all the modern philosophies, and he shows how he came to Christianity not from reading defenses of Christianity, but from reading the attacks on Christianity. And he saw how insane they all were, how they always led to madness. All the modern and all the alternative philosophies led to madness. They land, he says, in the clean, well-lit prison of one idea. And not only do they end in madness, but they end in a self-destructive and suicidal madness. He has this wonderful, stunning contrast between the two, really the only two choices, which is Christianity and Buddhism, ultimately the Western religion and the Eastern religion. And his great contrasted using the two symbols that represent both the cross and the circle. And he says the circle ends up being the serpent eating his own tail. And again, leads to an infinite madness. Whereas the cross, he says, extends its four arms into eternity without losing its shape. And to the people who say that all religions are the same, it's just that they practice them different, they express them different, Chesterton turns that on its head. He says, no, actually all religions look very much the same, and their forms and practices usually have quite a bit of similarities. They all have sacred texts and sacred robes and candles and rituals and things that they all practice, but they all believe something quite different. It's their fundamental spiritual reality that's absolutely different. And he says, as for the people who try to put them together, he says there are people who say that Christianity and Buddhism are exactly the same, especially Buddhism. And he points out other wonderful things when he says the worship of nature is unnatural, and puts the whole obsession with the environment in its place when he says that nature is not our mother. Nature is our sister, because we both have the same father. A wonderful perspective, so that we treat our sister with respect, but she has no authority over us. And then I read Heretics after that. So if you have been paying attention, if you know a few things about Chesterton, you can see that I'm doing this exactly backwards. I started with Everlasting Man, then St. Francis, then Orthodoxy, Heretics, exactly the opposite way in which he wrote them. But Heretics is another book that's packed full of Chesterton's rich thinking in such compact thought. And to me, it was all epitomized in the line in the chapter on paganism, where he says, charity means pardoning the unpardonable, or it's no virtue at all. And hope means hoping when things are hopeless, or it is no virtue at all. And faith means believing the incredible, or it's no virtue at all. Then I, as one untimely born, I then found the detective stories. And of course, I didn't start with the most obvious ones. I started with, didn't start with Father Brown. I started with Gabriel Gale and The Poet and the Lunatics. But then, of course, I eventually made my way to that little, how does he describe Father Brown? That plodding little priest that with the face of a potato. The Norfolk dumpling, yes. The Father Brown stories, which really changed the whole course of detective fiction. Up until the Father Brown stories, all detective fiction was Sherlock Holmes or bad imitations of Sherlock Holmes. But they always involved the super sleuth, the guy who's way too smart. Like those guys on CSI, you know. Oh yeah, this type of seaweed is found in only 3 parts of the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah, everybody knows that, right? Someone who can hear someone walking in the next room and figure out that one of his parents is Romanian, you know? Father Brown changes everything because Chesterton puts the detective on the same playing field, the level playing field with everyone else in the story, as well as the reader. So everyone's in it together. And Father Brown seems to be at a disadvantage. He always enters the story almost invisibly. He's introduced, oh yeah, and then there was a priest there as well. And it's never makes a grand entrance. And he's always overlooked, but he sees the one thing that everyone else overlooks. And he gives us that shock, that revelation that we didn't see coming, but all the clues were there the whole time. It was a new way of writing detective fiction, and he introduced the underdog detective. And that's what paved the way to Miss Marple and Columbo and Monk, these detectives who seem like they have something wrong with them. And of course, the thing that was wrong with Father Brown is that he was a priest, right? That was considered the big disadvantage. But what everyone considered the disadvantage was actually his advantage, because someone who sits in a confessional all day might know a thing or two about the criminal mind. And then I discovered the essays. And of course, what Chesterton is most famous for is the Father Brown stories. He continues to be most famous for them. In fact, BBC has just recently paid homage to Chesterton by having a new series with a character who has the same name as Father Brown. And that's where the similarity ends. But it's something, hopefully it'll make people read the original. But he's most famous for those detective stories now. And that's what was the reason for his lasting fame. But during his lifetime, he was most famous for his essays, for his journalism. That's why Chesterton was so popular in his lifetime. Everyone was reading him because his essays were always in front of them. They were, he wrote for several major newspapers, and then his essays would be reprinted in other newspapers, or they'd be quoted in other newspapers. And so the reason for his huge fame during his lifetime was not his books, it was his journalism. And part of the reason for his really precipitous fall from fame was that when he died, he stopped writing, as many writers do. And so he wasn't in front of people's face every day. And so his books, continued, and people were rediscovering him through his books. But and a few of them stayed in print always, but most of them went out of print. And now, thankfully, they're coming back into print. But now the new discovery is all this newspaper journalism that he wrote, which is as fresh and as relevant and as pertinent today as when he first wrote it. And it's just a great discovery. And of course, the way he writes an essay is exactly the way he writes a detective story. He gives you these facts. He starts with some problem, which is the equivalent of a fresh corpse found under the couch. Do they say couch here? I'm sorry, is that the wrong word? Okay, there's several words for that. Okay, I never know. And then he gives you some interesting information. All of it's useful, but none of it is pointing to the conclusion that he's going to shock you with. And so at the end of the essay, he's like a hawk circling aimlessly, and then swoops down dramatically with a conclusion that you did not see coming, even though All the clues were there. They just were leading you in a different direction. And he thrills you with a stunning conclusion, just like one of those detective stories. And probably the most perfect example of that is in his essay, The 12 Men, about the jury system, where he talks about sitting in the jury and watching the lawyers and the judge and just admiring their professionalism, but how they seem to forget that there's a human being that's on trial there, and that's why there needs to be a jury. And he says, our civilization has decided, and very justly decided, that determining the guilt or innocence of men is a thing too important to be trusted to trained men. If it wishes for light upon that awful matter, it asks men who know no more law than I know, who can feel the things that I felt in the jury box, when it wants a library cataloged or the solar system discovered or any trifle of that kind, well, then it uses up its specialists. But when it wishes anything done which is really serious, it collects 12 ordinary men standing around. The same thing was done, if I remember right, by the founder of Christianity. A perfect example, the stunning conclusion that you didn't see coming. Why are there 12 men in the jury? For the same reason there are 12 apostles. And so, and of course, the great quotes. I began collecting those Chesterton quotes. I still collect them. He's the most quotable writer of the 20th century. He says something about everything, and he says it better than anyone else. Many of them, of course, you've heard. You've heard things like the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It's been found difficult and left untried. Or you've heard the Bible tells us to love our neighbor and to love our enemies, generally because they're the same people. Or a thing worth doing is worth doing badly. Or angels fly because they take themselves lightly. Here's some you haven't heard. Uneducated people have no manners. Educated people have bad manners. Men do not produce art in order to be joyful. They are joyful, and therefore they produce art. Men do not dance in order to be happy. They dance because they are happy. Art is not the mother, but the child of beauty. The Reformation came. Scotland went Protestant. Ireland went Catholic. England went something or other. The scientific machine is now in the hands of men who dare not criticize it and do not know how to control it. If truth is relative, to what is it relative? I love that one. And here's one you may have heard. Take away the supernatural, and what remains is the unnatural. Chesterton always points to God in all of his writing. The amazing accomplishment of his journalism is that it was written for a secular audience, for the secular newspapers, and he was always pointing to God. Always had the eternal reference point, and always did it in just those amazing succinct quotations. England has given the world Shakespeare and Chesterton, satisfying all of the world's needs for good quotations. In America, we grow enough wheat to feed the world, but man cannot live on bread alone. And Chesterton says that men long for the right word as much as they long for bread. And he provides the right word. Well, what happened to me then is I went on and I got a master's degree. And I did a dissertation on Chesterton and Soren Kierkegaard. Now there's an unexpected combination. But what do they have in common? What they have in common is their splendid and essential use of paradox. And that's all about unexpected combinations. Truth is what you do not expect. Sometimes it's the opposite of what you expect. Truth only seems to work as a surprise. And sometimes truth seems to be a contradiction. The cross is the sign of contradiction. And I pointed out that Kierkegaard is full of paradox. Chesterton is full of paradox. The Bible is full of paradox. A virgin shall give birth. The dead shall rise. The first shall be last. Count it all joy when you meet various trials. I know you do. You're joyful now, even though you're having the trial of listening to me talk. But at this point, I thought I was still alone. I thought that I was the only one who was reading Chesterton in the world. But then I discovered the Chesterton Review and the amazing work of Father Boyd. And here was a scholarly journal, and there were other people reading Chesterton and taking him quite seriously, which was very reassuring. And through the Chesterton Review, I discovered that there was a small group that met in the Midwest, where I live in America, that met once a year and had a little conference. And so I attended that conference in Milwaukee. And I got there late, and I walked into the room, and there were about 30 people sitting on folding chairs. And as I walked in late, everyone turned and looked at me. Not because I was late, but because I was obviously 30 years younger than everyone else in the room. And they all started kind of salivating. Up in front, as I'm standing here in front of a podium, was an English gentleman talking about Chesterton's poetry, a gentleman by the name of Aidan Mackey. And so I had the privilege of discovering that there were people like me, only they were a lot older. And they immediately seized upon me to do everything. And that led to the founding of the American Chesterton Society, which was done for two reasons. One, I wanted to find all the other people who were interested in Chesterton. I wanted to get people interested in Chesterton so that the next generation was not cheated like my generation had been. And also, I wanted to recreate what I felt in that room that day, because there was such joy. There was so much fun. Chestertonians have such a good time together. And I wanted everyone to have that good time, that Christian joy that Chesterton brings. How come the world had forgotten Chesterton? He's a giant of literature. He should be counted among the immortals just for his book on Charles Dickens alone. Just that enough should make him required reading in every university. But also his book on St. Thomas, for his Ballad of the White Horse, really the last great epic poem written in the English language. I mean, he was accomplished in every literary genre that he touched, and he seems to have touched them all. And what he says of the poet Chaucer is true of himself. His own touch was as light as a feather, but the feather came from an angel's wing. When he writes about literature, when he writes about history and philosophy, theology, he'll toss some contemporary social criticism into the mix at the same time. When he writes about the peasant uprising under Richard II, he says, "They rose and killed the lawyers, a comprehensible and relatively even commendable course, though they also showed some disposition to hang anybody who could read or write, which is perhaps carrying the distrust of professionalism too far. But in spite of his mastery of every literary category, Chesterton is larger than all the categories that try to hold him. We have the great irony of the 300-pound writer who has fallen through the cracks. But then there is one category that for some people makes him seem small. And it is a category that he does fit into. Catholic. When Chesterton became Catholic, he suddenly had a new adjective in front of his name and in front of his title. Catholic author, Catholic writer. And for some people that meant putting him into a small box and setting him aside. And I have to admit that when I was reading Chesterton, I tried, as a good Baptist, to get around that Catholic stuff as much as I could. And I was doing some amazing serpentine in order to avoid it. And finally, I could not. Finally, I had to face it. I said, well, if Chesterton is so smart, because he obviously is right about all these things, how could he be so obviously wrong about that? I could not explain this one unexplainable thing about Chesterton. I mean, I could even explain distributism. And then the first tiny rumblings of an idea were kicked about when I heard that someone had suggested that Chesterton should be made a saint. And I had an epiphany. I had an instantaneous twinkle of an eye understanding of what the communion of the saints meant. This was an idea that was utterly foreign to me as a Baptist. I had no comprehension or appreciation of that idea. It was simply foreign to my theology and to my thinking altogether. But right then, as soon as someone said, well, Chesterton should be made a saint, I knew what the communion of the saints meant. I suddenly knew that, oh yes, saints don't get between you and God, as I had thought. They bring you closer to God. I suddenly understood that, yes, where Christ can sometimes seem an abstraction and hard to comprehend, a saint is a human and very concrete example of what it means to be a Christian, someone whom you can follow as a model. And I suddenly knew, yes, saints are in the presence of Christ. They are in the presence of God, obviously. I understood that saints are someone you go to ask for help, that you ask them to represent you. And saints are your friend. And there is a cult around every saint. And I suddenly realized, yes, I belong to the cult around Chesterton. And yes, he has been my friend. And yes, I would want him as my advocate. And yes, I have no doubt he's in the presence of God. And yes, he has brought me closer to God. And I said to my fellow Chestertonians, what a great idea. And their reaction, all of them were Catholic, their reaction was just the opposite. They said, oh no, this is not a good idea. They said, we should, it would not be a good idea for Chesterton to be canonized because that would suddenly make him too Catholic. I said, well, he is Catholic. And then they said, well, but it would turn people off to Chesterton, people like Dale here. I said, but I'm not turned off. I mean, I think this is very intriguing. I said, don't you understand? Our idea of saints is that they're barefoot 14-year-old girls. The idea of a 300-pound cigar-smoking journalist wearing a halo. I said, this is good for the Catholic Church. I said, you should canonize Chesterton and I'll become Catholic. And no one did anything. I had to become Catholic through the normal channels. And what's worse, I found myself having to lead the charge and start harassing bishops. I realized at a certain point that, well, yes, if he is a saint, that really becomes the most important thing about him. Everything else about him is important. But if he is a saint, that's the eternal thing. And it takes nothing away from his greatness as a writer, his importance as an artist. In fact, I think it only enhances it. Well, interestingly enough, I did become Catholic. The American Chesterton Society went from being a literary society to a Catholic apostolate. One day I get a phone call from, or maybe it was an email. Let's just say it was an email. It was some form of communication. Chesterton says we've come up with all the best forms of communication in all of history precisely at the moment when we have nothing to say. But this was from Marcus Grodi of EWTN, who hosts a television show called called The Journey Home, and it's about conversion. And he wanted to do a show on Chesterton's conversion. He wanted to do a show on several classic converts, and so he said, "Do you know anybody who could talk about Chesterton's conversion?" And I said, "Well, I know one person who could do it, but I can't give him a very good recommendation. But it would be me. But I'm a convert too, if that helps." He goes, "Oh, you're perfect. You're what we want." So I went to EWTN in Birmingham, Alabama, to different Birmingham, and not Birmingham, Vermont, which is what you were thinking of. All right, and we did the program, and when I walked off the set at the end, the producer came up to me and said, "We need to do a whole series on Chesterton, just from that 1 hour." And I said, "That's a great idea." I said, "Let me see if we can find someone to do that." She said, No, we want you." I said, "Well, let's talk about this." And I brought in my friend Chuck Chauberg, who portrays Chesterton, and we created this show that is really unlike anything else, not only on EWTN, but on all of television. And I'm pleased to say it's been on for 12 years, and it's really brought a lot of people to G.K. Chesterton. And it's just a thrill to be able to do that show. We have some new programs coming out in the next few months. I don't know how long it'll run, but it's certainly borne a lot of fruit. Well, how are we doing for time, Martin? I don't want... how much time do I have left here? You've got another 5 minutes. 5 minutes, perfect. I'll finish this in 5 minutes. Yes, I will. I'll just tear this up. No, you haven't. No, it's only 25 to live. You know, for me, again, the idea of Chesterton being a saint, for me, meant that the fullness of Chesterton became even fuller. There's the great paradox Chesterton describes for the convert when he enters the church. He says the church is larger on the inside than it is on the outside. And the more you get into Chesterton, the more you realize that he too is larger on the inside than he is on the outside. He is just such a deep well. And I have had this privilege of reading him and studying him for 33 years. And I've read just about everything that's available. And there's still more out there that we're finding. The incredible amount that he wrote. When I started talking about how much Chesterton had written, we used to say that he'd written 4,000 essays. Since that time, we've discovered another 1,000 essays. So the number's up to 5,000. And it's probably going to grow. And it's all good. That's what's so amazing. And he has the great distinction of having seen it on both sides. He wrote as a non-Catholic and then as a Catholic. And yet you see this, it's almost a seamless transition. His writing does not really change significantly, or even at all in most cases, in his post-conversion writings. His trajectory of the truth is absolutely consistent. And this is why he has such an appeal to non-Catholics as well as Catholics. He really is one of the great ecumenical writers because the truth is just simply attractive. And he does it in such an invitational way, in such a kind and joyful way. He makes the truth irresistible because the truth is irresistible like a magnet. But he says, like a magnet, it can repel some people. And so he's always trying to track down and chase that person who has been repelled by the truth and bring them back, bring them closer to the truth again. And that's why he uses other ways of talking about the truth, and his most effective way is his essential writings on social justice and distributism and creating a just society. And this is one of the great ways he appeals to the non-Catholic, and and even to the non-believer altogether. His ideas on social justice have been dismissed for a long time, and now they are absolutely being taken seriously again as we watch the downfall of capitalism and socialism and just the collapse of a centralized, both centralized commercial system and a centralized government that simply has lost touch with the common man. And Chesterton is trying to bring back the importance of the family, the importance of autonomy, and the importance of justice. He says if we really believed in democracy, we wouldn't be debating about what to do with the poor. The poor would be debating about what to do with us. And when he became Catholic, he wrote a letter to his mother explaining why he was going to become Catholic. And he said, I am convinced that the fight for the family and for the free citizen and for everything decent must now be conducted by the one fighting form of Christianity. That's what he called the Catholic Church, the one fighting form of Christianity that was going to protect the family, the free citizen, and everything decent. And that's what Chesterton himself is a warrior for. He's fighting for the family, he's fighting for the free citizen, and he's fighting for everything decent. And he says, if there are ghastly things to be faced, the only thing we can do is make it glorious to face them. And there's this joy in his sense of battle because there's this thrill in defending the truth and for fighting for what's right. But he does it not only with his genius, but with his geniality. And he used all of the good gifts that God gave him for goodness. And people are attracted to his goodness. And at the very end of The Everlasting Man, he says there are really two kinds of people. He says there are those who bring the message, and there are those who have not heard it or who cannot believe it. And we have been blessed with the message, and we have this evangelical duty to bring it to those who have either not yet heard it or cannot believe it. And he says the hagiological way is the logical way. And though it may seem extreme and startling, well, logical things often do. A lot of people don't know. I'll close with this. A lot of people don't know this. They forget that Thomas More was canonized in the 1930s during Chesterton's lifetime. And when he was canonized, Chesterton said, Thomas More is more important now than he was in his own lifetime because he defended not only the faith against the state, but he defended the family against the state. And those two things are more under attack now even than they were then. And he says Thomas More is going to be more important in the future than he is now. Well, I would leave you with this. G.K. Chesterton is more important now than he was in his own lifetime, and he'll be more important in the future than he is now. God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dale. I knew that you wouldn't be disappointing. You never are. Superb speaker, very gifted. We've got a little bit of time. Would you be prepared to take a few questions?
Absolutely. I don't have to give answers, do I? All right.
Can you just tell us something about his family faith? Was he born into
Chesterton was a convert himself. He was raised. His family were his parents were Unitarians. They went to a very low church setting with a speaker, a preacher named Stopford Brooke. And so they exposed him to everything as a result of that. They had sort of a universalist approach. And unfortunately, as a result of being exposed to everything, one of the things he experimented with was spiritualism. And Chesterton says he believed in the devil before he believed in God. And he found his way to Christianity, which he explains in the book Orthodoxy. And part of the reason he became a Christian was through meeting his fiancée, Frances Blogg, who he said was the first Christian he ever met who was happy. And so she got him into the Anglican Church. So they were married in the Anglican Church, but he really began his steady move towards Rome. He considered himself at a certain point an Anglo-Catholic, and then at a certain point he said he was not yet Catholic but no longer Protestant. And then in 1922, at the age of 48, he became Catholic. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry, was he influenced by Newman? Well, he read Newman. He certainly was familiar with Newman, so I'm sure that some of Newman's arguments seeped in. He was, even though he writes very little about Newman, there's probably 2 or 3 essays. There's a treatment of Newman in his book on Victorian literature, but it's clear that he had a good grasp of Newman. Yes. Yes.
Can I make a comment and ask a question?
All right.
The first part of your... Is that on? Yes. First part of your talk reminded me of the news last night. I don't know whether you saw the news last night, but there was this girl who'd been deaf since birth and had been given a cochlear implant and had heard for the first time in her life, and she broke down in tears.
Oh.
And your discovery of Chesterton reminded me of that episode. A more serious question is that anti-Semitism has been leveled against Chesterton. What's your response to that?
Yes, that is the unfortunate charge against Chesterton that keeps being repeated, and we have we devoted an entire issue of Gilbert Magazine, the magazine that the American Chesterton Society publishes, and we really dealt with it as thoroughly as we possibly could in between the covers of a magazine, and it really boils down to he did criticize the Jews, certain Jews. Didn't make blanket statements about the Jews, but he criticized everybody. Though there was no one who was safe from his pen when he as a critic. He criticized the Americans, he criticized the Germans, he criticized the Asians as well, the Japanese and the Chinese. He criticized even the Irish, who he liked. Yes, he criticized the Italian fascists as well, and the one he criticized the most was himself. And he says, the one criticism that is most lacking is self-criticism. But he saw that what the Jews needed was their own country. He said the problem is that they're foreigners in a strange land scattered throughout Europe, and they need their own homeland. And so the Jewish Zionists absolutely tapped Chesterton's energy to help recreate a homeland for the Jews in Israel again, because he says they need their own autonomy, and they'll always have a mixed loyalty in every nation that they're in, because they'll be loyal to the Jews as well as the mixed loyalty to the homeland that's hosting them. And he said the Jews, by their own account, never feel completely comfortable in a Christian setting or a non-Jewish setting. They're always going to feel like they're outsiders. And so that's what he had lobbied for. But to say that he hated the Jews is always an unfair charge. And he himself said, if I hated the Jews, I would admit that. The term anti-Semitism is a squeaky, slippery term that doesn't quite mean anything, and it's just simply used to dismiss people and to attack people. And he says he stood very, very firmly in defending the Jews when they were attacked. And he was the first to speak out against Hitler and the Nazis. He really was the very first writer to speak out against the treatment of the Jews in Germany. And for the critics who said that he just wants to get the Jews out of Europe, Chesterton says, I will die defending the last Jew in Europe. And so the charge is unfair, and it keeps getting repeated. And the problem is there's no arbiter who can say Chesterton is anti-Semitic, Chesterton isn't. And so the charge gets bandied back and forth. We have to defend Chesterton against the charge. He was aware of it in his own lifetime. He laughed it off in his own lifetime. Then he took it seriously because other people were taking it seriously. And I think by the end of his life, he was laughing it off again. He says, there are still people who think that I am torturing Jews in my basement. Yeah. Yes?
Did anyone influence Chesterton?
Yes, the people who influenced Chesterton are the great English writers, Charles Dickens and William Shakespeare and Robert Louis Stevenson. It's amazing. The influences in his life were all literary, and they helped create Chesterton's outlook for life. There's one American writer in there that had a great influence on him, and that was Walt Whitman. Yeah. Well, George MacDonald, he's also had an influence on him too. Absolutely, yes. Is that it? That's it. Well, here's
Your conscience has stepped up and said,
I have a little book. I brought about 12 copies of a Chesterton dictionary that I've been putting together for about 20 years. And so it's to show that Chesterton really is the heir of Dr. Johnson. He did write a dictionary. It's just that I had to edit it for him. But so come and get a Chesterton dictionary. Okay.